Hello everyone, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink, another Slimline card. This one using some of the new products that Simon's Stamp just released as part of their Let's Connect, aka August 2020 release. So my first step with this was I wanted to see if I could use the new Detail Petal Plate Wafer die on a Slimline background. This wafer die is A2 size, and it cuts all around the perimeter. So to enable it to work on a longer piece of cardstock, I have my cardstock lined up inside the die, and then the end of the die I have hanging over my cutting plates so that any area not sandwiched between the cutting plates of my die cut machine, any die cut machine should work with this, doesn't cut. So with this also, because I'm using a smaller piece of cardstock, nothing's getting cut, if that makes sense, because I'm not using the perimeter. All I wanted was all that piercing detail because I thought it was so pretty. So I ran it through once, so part of the cardstock has all that piercing detail. And then to get the rest of the cardstock on this piece, I lined it up with the pattern. And just by pressing with my thumbs, I could kind of press in part of the pattern so then it's all lined up. Just like so. And then it's not like wiggling around or anything. So I know the pattern's lined up, so it's going to continue. This time I taped it into place just so it doesn't shift. And then I'm doing the same thing. I'm laying the die back down onto my cutting plate and letting that end hang off the edge. And then when I stick the second cutting plate, I'm lining that up so you can see that wafer die is hanging out so that area won't cut and it keeps this entire piece intact. And I got the entire pattern on it. I was so happy with how it turned out, and it went a lot quicker and easier than I thought it would. I'm going to be using this detail petal plate, say that 3 times fast, more often because it's pretty. It can create such subtle backgrounds, and I love the detail of it. So anyway, that was the background. For the main, focus of this card, I'm using the interactive toilet paper slider wafer dies. There's this one. There's actually a little interactive toilet wafer die in this release, which I laughed when I opened the package. And then there's a stamp set. I'm going to use a couple sentiments from the stamp set, and then we'll just get on with it. So I die cut the toilet paper rolls multiple times from white cardstock. And I used a little bit of Copic markers just to add a bit of shading, just some cool grays, just to give them a little more depth and dimension. And then I had 2 options. I was going to die cut just the top portion of that toilet paper roll to get little circles to fill in for the, where the toilet paper, like little cardboard piece would be. But rather than do that, this was a lot faster by just trimming down little pieces of a scrap piece of cardstock. This is just Nina Desert Storm, my current fave. It's always been a fave, but I'm just reaching for it all the time lately. But I found that by just cutting little squares like this, one was faster, and 2, it looks better because it's adhered behind the toilet paper roll. Plus I added a tiny bit more of the C2 Copic marker just to give it that little, again, extra bit of shading. So I did that with all the rolls. And then I cut the slider portion multiple times as well. And then just cut the end off so I could adhere it to some of these so it looks like they're starting to unravel because, just a little extra something. So once I've got all of my toilet paper rolls shaded, the little inner piece there adhered and shaded, and then I adhered some of these little extra ends, I have one full slider here, and I'm going to stamp one of the sentiments from the We're Like Toilet Paper stamp set. If you had told me a year ago that this would be a thing, well, none of us would have believed anything of this year. I'm not even going to get into it. Anyway, I lined this up in my Misty because I knew I wanted to stamp it a couple times with Simon's Intense Black ink. So I lined up the sentiment towards the end or the right-hand side of this slider portion. And then while I had my Misty out, I grabbed just a scrap of black cardstock, and I'm stamping another sentiment from that We're Like Toilet Paper stamp set. I'm not worried about lining up the stamp. Doesn't matter. I just wanted to white heat emboss it onto this black cardstock. So I'd use my anti-static powder tool. I stamped the stamp with clear embossing ink. I coated it with detail white embossing powder, melted it with my heat tool. And then once this was all melted, I'm going to use, there's a coordinating wafer die in the We're Like Toilet Paper wafer die set. Because there's wafer dies for all the little images, but then there's a few dies for the sentiments as well, which always makes me happy. Hence me not needing to line it up or anything like that. So I die cut that sentiment. And then now I need to start laying out all these rolls of toilet paper and making this work. So you can see the slider mechanism there that I'd stamped a sentiment on. It's technically too wide for my card front because I'm doing a slimline card, and this panel is roughly, it's about 3 1/4 by 8 1/4 inches, something like that. It's smaller than my card base anyway. So to make this work, I just shortened the slider portion. I cut the end off there, the handle, I guess you want to call it. It's the stopper. That's what it is. It's the stopper. And I'll show when I start assembling how that comes in handy. So I just trimmed it down. So it's a little bit shorter, so it'll fit nicely behind this panel. And then I basically kind of eyeballed it where I want this to go. And then there's this little slot wafer die that comes in the set. So I ran that through my die cut machine. So now I have the slot for this to slide through. And this is where you can see the stopper keeps it from just pulling right out of the card. So now that I've got that, all it really needs to be done is adhere all of the pieces onto the front of the card. And then I'm also going to adhere some stuff on the back as well. So I die cut some hearts from some red cardstock. There's a little heart wafer die in this toilet paper slider set. So I started to adhere that, but then decided before I get to really assembling everything, I wanted to make sure I kind of mapped out the back. You could use foam tape for this, no problem. I decided to just go with a couple strips of cardstock since I had an extra piece sitting here, and I have tons of scraps of this color. This is Simon's Sea Glass cardstock, one of my favorites. So I have tons of scraps. So rather than use foam tape, because I also didn't want this to be too bulky, I'm just using 2 extra layers of cardstock here, and I'm basically just kind of creating a channel. I want to cover the back of this with these 2 layers of cardstock, but also create the channel for this slider to be able to move back and forth and not wobble all over the place, etc. So I just had all these different kind of sized widths of the cardstock. It doesn't have to be the exact same color. I could use white, I could use whatever, but it was sitting here, I used it. So I created these little channels, and then I also butted up a couple pieces on either side of this slider just to keep it from wobbling, back and forth. Just, again, keeps things a little more simpler once the card is assembled. So I just kept cutting it down. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect because this is the back. No one's going to see it once this is adhered. So I added all these little pieces to the back of this card front. Made sure everything's working good. It is. I filled in a couple little spots there on the top and bottom just to give it the stability. And then I can start adhering all of the little toilet paper rolls to the front. And really with a card like this, you could almost skip all these layers of cardstock on the back. You could technically just adhere down, just make sure to avoid putting glue in the channel area. But I wanted it to give that little bit of extra wiggle room so that the slider moves back and forth a little bit easier. So after I've got the back all ready to go, I started adhering the rolls just using some thin 3D foam squares. And the only part you have to really be careful with is obviously where the actual slider is. So I just made sure not to adhere on the slider or on the opening. So the foam tape is to the left of it. That way everything can move back and forth, no problem. So I've got my little stack here, my little wobbling stack of toilet paper on the front of this card. I added the die cut sentiment. And I, as an afterthought, decided to add some red baker's twine to this, just to kind of tie it in with that little red heart. So threaded that kind of in between a couple of these rolls of toilet paper. Like to hold my knot in place with my little reverse tweezers. This is a must-have tool. I've been using these for years. I keep a second pair handy because they always grow legs and walk away. So anywho, tied a little bow with that little baker's twine, and then trimmed off the ends with my scissors once I was kind of happy with where everything was placed. And then I also die cut more hearts. I pulled out, this is an oldie but goodie. I used this in a previous video not too long ago. The mini hearts wafer die set. This came out years ago. It's still one of my favorite little die sets because, yeah, I've kept all these wafer dies together. just cut a row of hearts from whatever color I need, and then I've got all these embellishments, you know, ready to go. So I die cut these little mini hearts from the same red cardstock and then kind of sprinkled them throughout the card, just kind of tie it all together. And then I'm just going to adhere them into place with little dabs of Simon's Craft Tacky Glue. So once I've got these adhered, I can start working on the final little elements of my card. So got my hearts adhered, and then I'm going to go on to adhering this to a frame that I'd cut down of just black cardstock, and I cut the black cardstock just slightly larger than the sea glass cardstock, just to give something to adhere to and make things a little easier when I adhere this to the actual card. So same thing, I'm just applying adhesive to all these pieces of blue cardstock that I used and avoiding where the actual slider is. Don't want to glue that down. It needs to be able to move. So made sure the slider was not in the way. And then because I'm using liquid glue, it gives me those few seconds of wiggle room to make sure I get this centered onto that piece of black cardstock. And then always double check, made sure the slider was still working. Everything's good. So now I can work on my card base, which is Nina Desert Storm cardstock. I'd cut this down to 7 inches. So it's 7 by 8.5. And I scored it at 3.5. So this will be a 3.5 inch by 8.5 inch slimline card. So after I made my card base, I'm going to put this back in my MISTI, and I'm going to stamp another sentiment from the Weir like toilet paper set. And the sentiment says, "I love you with all my toilet paper." My stash of toilet paper is bigger than my heart. Again, it made me laugh. I had to use it. So I lined up the sentiment on the inside of the card, and I stamped that again with Simon's Intense Black ink. And then I had die cut more toilet paper rolls, added that bit of shading with the same Copic markers. So I'm going to adhere those to the inside of the card. I'm going to add a couple more of those little ends like I had done on the front of the card. And then I'm just going to adhere the few remaining little die cut hearts as well. Just they're sitting there, why not add them and just kind of tie it all together. So once I've got those adhered, I can then adhere the card front to my card base. So again, more liquid glue so I can wiggle everything around and make sure that's adhered. And then once this is adhered in place, this card is complete. I'm going to pair it with one of the new Slimline envelopes that Simon released. I will have a link to this release in the description box below the video, by the way, as well as all the supplies used. But yeah, paired it with the Slimline TEAL envelope, just kind of tied it all together, and this card is complete. So this video is actually part of a blog hop for this release. I will have all the info in my blog post. You can check it out in the description box below the video. I'll link to my blog post. I'll have links to all the supplies used, the release, etc. So just check it out below if you are interested. Thank you all so much for watching and subscribing, thumbs upping, commenting. I really appreciate it. And I will see you all very soon in the next video. Bye.